A majority of African Americans say they have been victims of racial profiling by police. This issue has been hotly debated in recent days. VOA's Chris Simkins explains why.
The arrest of Harvard University professor Henry Louis Gates and his charges of racism against white police officer James Crowley reignited a national debate about racial profiling. The head of the National Association of Black Law Enforcement Officers, Charles Wilson, says too often police stop, question, or arrest people based on their skin color rather than real evidence.
The institution of policing is and always has been inherently biased against people of color and low income. And you must accept that as a fact.
Racial profiling is the practice of using race or ethnic characteristics in determining whether a person is considered likely to commit a crime. For example, statistics show black drivers are much more likely to have their cars stopped and searched than white drivers. Scott Newman, a hotel manager in Washington, D.C., says that happened to him.
Pulled over for no reason whatsoever, not speeding, and they just unpacked my entire car for no reason at all, looking for drugs or something, but found nothing.
Paul Butler, a former federal prosecutor, recalls being arrested in front of his home after a dispute with a neighbor over a parking space.
When the police came out, they saw a black man, and as soon as they saw me, it's like they wanted to arrest. They didn't even want to listen to what I had to say.
Racial profiling by police is complicated further by factors of class and cultural behavior. Newspaper columnist Stephen Smith says while there's been progress in race relations, encounters between blacks and police remain complicated.
Well, the first thing that goes through a black person's mind is that they suspect that they were racially profiled. That's just the reality of the situation.
The FBI says black men are incarcerated at roughly 7 times the rate of their white counterparts. And a recent public opinion poll showed a majority of blacks say they do not receive equal treatment from police compared to whites. And in several states, blacks have successfully won racial profiling lawsuits against police departments. Rebecca Headon, a staff attorney with the ACLU, says racial profiling affected encounters in the 1960s between civil rights activists and white police officers. But Headon says things have improved somewhat since then.
There are many police officers who do their job with the utmost professionalism, but unfortunately there are also officers who exhibit racially biased policing, who do perform racial profiling.
Retired New York State Trooper Pete Rubino says policing has come a long way, but a lot more improvement is needed. He says law enforcement officers are disturbed by accusations of racial profiling in the Gates case.
They're human beings. They're seeing this all over the paper, all over the news. It does affect them how they approach calls. When they respond to calls now, there's a sense of now danger also for them.
The Cambridge Police Department, which arrested Professor Gates, is one of many police agencies across the country that have programs designed to help officers understand cultural differences, calm tense encounters, and navigate through negative perceptions. Chris Simkins, VOA News, Washington.
Now, to quell the controversy, President Obama has invited Professor Henry Louis Gates and Sergeant James Crowley to meet with him at the White House this evening. And joining us now to add perspective is Matthew Fogg of the Congress Against Racism and Corruption in Law Enforcement. Would like to welcome you to In Focus, Mr. Fogg.
Good to be here.
So I saw you nodding your head as we were watching the package, specifically the part that said that blacks are 7 times more likely than their white counterparts to be profiled. Is that really what's going on?
That's correct. And being in law enforcement 30 years as a U.S. Marshal and worked the cases all over the country, I have actually seen it myself, and I know that it does exist. And even when it doesn't exist, there's a perception out there that that's always the issue. And that's one of the things that we really want to try to clean up when we talk about community policing. But it is a real problem.
Now, when you say sometimes it's perceived, how many times is it perceived as opposed to being the actual reality?
Well, it's just like what's going on now in America. Once an incident takes place and it's publicized, a lot of African Americans, for example, if you get stopped, even when the police would get behind me sometimes, I would be concerned because I wasn't exactly sure what they were going to do. We know that it exists. We know that African Americans are locked up, as they say, 7 times more. We know that the whole system of how the criminal justice system has a disproportionate number of us in that system. So what has happened is has put a negative aura over the whole system. So to say which incident is racial profiling and which incident isn't, I can't say that exactly, but I can say that it's a real problem. It's perceived by most African Americans.
To go back to what actually ignited this whole controversy, the arrest of Professor Gates by Sergeant Crowley, and of course they're going to be meeting with President Obama this evening at the White House.
Right.
Where does profiling begin, or when does actual law enforcement take place? How do you distinguish between the two? And in that particular case, was it profiling, or was it just, as President Obama said, an overreaction on both parts?
Well, one of the things is, and certainly he had more information than I did, but as the information is now coming out, for example, we hear this discrepancy in what the woman who actually made the phone call said. She said she didn't mention nothing about race. Then you have an officer putting on this form that apparently race, there were 2 African-American males involved. With that discrepancy, that's the type of problem we start talking about racial profiling. What's in the minds of the officers when they make the stop? Is it simply because if you see a road and you got people speeding down the road and you only stop, say, the people of color, that would be racial profiling when everyone was speeding. That's the problem when we start talking about racial profiling. The only way you can get to really the bottom of it is you got to capture the numbers. When New Jersey had the problem, they decided to start capturing the numbers of race, who they actually wrote citations and that type of thing. So it is a bigger problem than just simply what happened in the Gates incident. But again, with that incident, the police came to the scene. Apparently, once they identified the fact that the man was in his own home, everybody understands that that whole situation should have ratcheted down at that point, and it shouldn't have been no arrest. But the bottom line, it was an arrest, and that's, I think, what created this story we have today.
Now, of course, President Obama will be meeting with both of them this evening. What's the larger picture? Besides just easing tensions between these 2 men, what's the message to America where, in terms of race and where it stands really in this country?
Well, it is a real problem. Being 30 years in law enforcement myself, it is a real problem. I used to have the discussion with my officers doing operations where we would target our particular, for example, in the drug war, we would go into certain areas, urban areas, constantly targeting the urban areas when we knew that drugs was everywhere. So the question was, why are we simply targeting urban areas? And it came down to it, that's the weakest link. But the bottom line is we need to really address it as a real serious problem in America, that even that the perceptions are out there or whether it's real, we need to address it.
Now, you know, some would say really, okay, there's still this argument that racism is still very extensive in this country.
Right.
But when you look at the elections, it was really the white vote and, of course, the Hispanics that put President Obama in office. And when you look at it in that respect, I mean, blacks only accounted for 13%. When you put it in that respect and you keep hearing this perpetuated statement that there's a lot of racism in this country, how do you reconcile it?
Well, first thing, I don't look at it from the perspective that only whites put him in the White House.
Majority, a significant number.
I understand, but I mean, what I'm saying is every vote counts. I believe that every vote put him in the White House. And the bottom line is America should be handling it from that perspective. The news should be reporting it from that perspective. It's every vote that counts, and therefore any Americans that when you look at anybody being treated disproportionate in America when it comes down to any issue, whether it's health issues, whether it's crime, and you see these disproportionate numbers, you got to say there's a problem.
But you keep also hearing how many people were just amazed that a black man has been elected in this country. What does that say about where this race relations is going?
Well, it says that it took a long time. It has that there are some improvements that a black man can run and be accepted as a president of the United States. But at the same time, the underlying problem is still there. And it's very pervasive, and it's there, and we need to address it, and talking about it in dialogue and having these discussions is where we need to be.
Where would you want to see this conversation with President Obama and the 2 men lead to after tonight?
I hope it leads to where we will actually maybe even concern about some legislation as to how we can deal with it. Maybe capturing numbers, maybe getting police force, more community policing, getting people to break down these barriers that we have that when it comes down to public offices, public space, not public space, public paradigms like policing. How do we neutralize it? How do we make people feel comfortable? Again, like I said, as a law enforcement, former law enforcement officer, when the police get behind me, there is some concern if I'm in certain towns or certain locations in this country, what are they going to do?
Thank you so much. That's Mr. Matthew Fogg, a retired U.S. Marshal, Deputy U.S. Marshal. Really thank you for being here with us.
Okay.
Okay.